Viridian, the Green Guide, written by Clouds, read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 69, Opportunities. Shota watched the exam in shock. With how insistent Viridian was that he couldn't be a hero, the UA entrance exam was the last place he'd expected to find him, and yet he was currently watching a kid with an extremely distinct fighting style blow through robots like they were nothing. It was surreal, and Shota really wanted to get his hopes up and run down to the field so that he could arrest the kid as soon as the exam was over. But he couldn't help the nagging realization that a few things just didn't match up. First of all, Viridian was the type of person who always gave his all, or at least Shota thought he was. However, even after 10 months, Shota had never once heard of him using an electricity quirk. Even in fights where using a quirk like that could have made the difference between victory and failure. A few vigilantes chose to hide their quirks, of course, but those were usually planning on being vigilantes long term, and Viridian hadn't been in that mindset when he was first establishing himself. He'd been planning on dying within the first few months, so there was no reason for him to hide a quirk, even if it could have identified him. Which brought Shota to his current question. If the kid he was watching take the exam really was Viridian, why had he completely ignored a powerful potential weapon that would have helped him fight and save people? However, even if Shota ignored the whole quirk inconsistency, things still didn't add up. He'd asked to see the file, and this danky Kaminari didn't look anything like his problem child. That could be explained away too, of course, by saying that he might know someone with a quirk that switched faces or changed someone's appearance, or even that he knew enough about makeup and cosplay to be able to pass for another person in the low light and high adrenaline environment that was nighttime heroics. But again, the only people who would think about disguising themselves like that were those that were capable of planning for the future. Viridian hadn't been planning on living long enough for being recognized to ever become a real problem, which left the obvious conclusion that this kid wasn't Viridian at all. But that somehow seemed the most illogical possibility that Shota had considered yet. As far as Shota knew, Viridian didn't have any formal combat training. He had learned to fight on the streets, watching pro heroes take down villains, and then taking them down himself. So his fighting style was one of a kind and wasn't something that Shota had ever seen anywhere else. It was completely unique to the problem child, and it would stand to reason that the only person alive that would fight with a style identical to Viridian's was the vigilante himself. The longer he watched the exam, however, the more Shota had to begrudgingly admit that the fighting styles weren't exactly identical. Kaminari used many of the same moves and techniques that Viridian did, but he heavily incorporated electricity, and he didn't use pipes or a slingshot, even though pipes would probably prove useful in the long run if he knew how to use them. Viridian moved the same way Kaminari did, but he relied primarily on weapons and improvised strategies instead of his quirk, which was why his file was full of theories about various mental quirks rather than something more combat-oriented. By the end of the exam, Shota was still only about 50% sure that he'd actually found Viridian's civilian identity. He would need to actually confront the kid to be sure, but even though he tried telling himself that this whole situation was too good to be true, he couldn't help getting his hopes up. If this kid really was his problem child, this would be the perfect opportunity to get him off the streets, out of dangerous cases, and into therapy. It was almost too much to hope for. When the final bell announced the end of the exam, Shota cleared his throat. I have a few questions for one of the examinees. Is there any way we could ask Denki Kaminari to stick around for a few minutes? Mike chuckled and pointed at the screen. It looks like he's not going to have much of a choice if Recovery Girl has anything to say about it. It looks like he overused his quirk or something to stop that zero pointer there at the end. Sure enough, When Shota turned back to the screen, Kaminari was simply wandering around the fake city with a dazed and happy look on his face. The girl he'd saved, Uraraka, had hurried to help him down from the robot and was currently guiding him by the elbow to make sure that he didn't run into a wall or trip over any of the debris that was scattered around the city. Shota made a note to ask Nezu about adding a few more rescue points to her total, because even if the exam was technically over, the true mark of a hero was saving people even when no one was watching. Knowing the rat, though, he was already taking that into account. The whole situation was yet another strike against him being Viridian, though. There was a reason that Shota had deemed him a problem child, after all, and he knew better than most that the kid often ran into fights he wasn't prepared for and pushed himself past his limits to win. And yet, with as many times as he would have sworn that Viridian was inches away from death, he'd never seen the vigilante wandering around dazed like that, even after the worst fights. The closest he'd ever come to that state, as far as Shota could remember, was the time he'd gotten a concussion while fighting that crab villain. That move he did with the zero-pointer was extremely impressive, All Might noted. He took down a robot larger than most buildings with a single move, which not only shows power, but an extraordinary level of control. Is that why you're taking a special interest in him, Aizawa? Shota shrugged. I'm not taking a special interest in him. He's just got potential, that's all. He didn't want to say anything about his suspicions until he was actually sure, but Shota could tell that Nezu had already put together the real reason why he was interested in the kid. It wasn't as if the rat was being subtle. Aizawa knew Nezu was running the probabilities of them discovering Viridian's identity just by the mischievous twinkle in the rat's eyes as he passed Kaminari's open file over to All Might, who took it with interest. Shota scoffed and turned away. He needed more coffee. He didn't agree with Nezu's decision to add All Might to the staff, but so far the man hadn't done anything to purposefully piss him off. Despite his lack of teaching credentials, he seemed earnest enough, if a little clueless about how school and teaching actually worked. Shota's biggest concern, however, wasn't All Might's teaching skills, even with how dismally insufficient they were. No, oddly enough, his biggest concern with All Might teaching at UA was his connection to All for One. After Tsukashi had let slip that All for One was the villain that had forced All Might into a pseudo-retirement, Nezu had agreed to set up a meeting with all four of them so that Shota could learn everything he knew about the symbol of evil. All Might had apologized profusely for misidentifying his nemesis as dead, which Shota appreciated, even if it didn't do much good, but he hadn't been able to share much more about All for One's quirk than Viridian had uncovered. What he had done was point Shota in the direction of his old mentor, Gran Torino, who had been a little more knowledgeable about All for One's history, if nothing else. If Shota had to describe the old geezer, it would be as if someone had combined Shota's logical ruses with Miss Joke's prankster nature and given the result dementia. The fact that All Might seemed terrified of him was just the cherry on top. He'd actually been having a very odd cup of tea with the geezer and picking his brain about All for One when Endeavor had decided to go on his rampage. He regretted not being there, but he stood by his decision to go and chase the lead. They had had no way of knowing when or where Endeavor would show up, so Shota had decided to chase their most solid lead and hope that it would be enough to find the villain factory before things hit the fan. Obviously, it hadn't been enough. Endeavor had chosen the worst possible timing, especially considering that the hero's main plan for dealing with a modified Endeavor was having Shota erase his quirk. If Viridian hadn't come prepared with a plan that didn't use erasure, there would most likely have been a lot more casualties that night. Thankfully, it appeared the experiments weren't as far along as Viridian had feared, but information on All for One was lacking. Shota felt like there was something All Might wasn't telling him. He'd hoped that Gran Torino would be a little more forthcoming, but there was no luck on that front either. Shota couldn't even blame it on the fact that he'd had to rush out of their last meeting because even though they'd had several follow-up phone calls since then, Gran Torino still only shared the most basic information and seemed to be keeping something to himself. It was beyond frustrating. He had brought up his concerns with Nedzu, but the rat was as infuriatingly cryptic as ever and just told him to trust the symbol of peace. Shota thought that was completely illogical, but there wasn't much he could do. Still, he hoped for everyone's sake that Viridian was wrong and All for One wasn't behind the villain factory after all. Because it was one thing to have the symbol of peace come and impart his knowledge and experience to the next generation. But it was another thing completely to invite in someone with a dangerous nemesis into a school with children who couldn't defend themselves yet and risk painting a target on all of their backs. Shota groaned and stretched as he stood and started making his way down to Recovery Girl's office. He could deal with All for One and All Might's secrets later. For right now, he had to go meet the kid who was hopefully his vigilante problem child. At this point, he was just trying to take things one mystery at a time. Kotsky didn't know how he was supposed to feel walking away from UA. He'd passed the exam. There was no way he hadn't. But the jealous and amazed looks that he wouldn't even have noticed 10 months ago now just irked him. He wasn't better than any of them, not really. Yeah, he had a strong quirk, and he'd trained hard with it, but he'd made a lot of mistakes too. So who was he to take a spot that could easily have gone to any of them? He shook his head and tried to ignore those feelings. There wasn't really anything he could do about it besides keep working hard and try to deserve his place, so there wasn't any point in worrying about it. He'd done his best, and he knew that Ogawa would be insufferable about it if he was there, but the stupid octopus would have to settle for Kotsky saving his dumb ass since he had been stupid enough to go and get himself disappeared. Kotsky tried not to wonder if Izuku would be proud of him too. If he hadn't been such a jerk, the nerd would have been able to be there himself. Kotsky tried to ignore everyone as he made his way toward the gates. But just as he was walking through the courtyard, he noticed another examinee that looked familiar for some reason, and it took Kotsky a few seconds to place him. The kid had purple hair and was tall and lanky, not that it was that noticeable with the way he was slouched, and he seemed to be absolutely pissed, which probably meant that he hadn't gotten enough points to pass. It was the eye bags that gave him away, though. It was hard to completely forget about the first kid he'd really saved. "Hey," Kotsky called out to him. "You're that one kid. I told you that you didn't have what it took to be a villain." The kid turned around and glared at him. "Yeah, well, it looks like I didn't have what it takes to be a hero either. Sure, I can try again at the sports festival, whatever. But what's the point when even the test is designed to make sure I fail?" Kotsky ignored the glare. It was his default expression, so it was probably this kid's as well. Goodness knew how pissed off he'd be if he had to deal with people calling him a villain every day. "So you're just going to give up?" "I don't know. That seems kind of weak." "Like you would know." Eyebags turned and started walking away. "I heard what the other kids said about you, Bakugo. Explosions? Your quirk is absolutely perfect for being a hero and destroying stupid robots to get points. You've never had to work a day in your life to get your dream, just because you were born lucky. You get to be a hero just by existing." Kotsky silently fell into step beside him. A part of him wanted to tear into his kid Shinso? Was he remembering the name right? Anyway, who did Shinso think he was to judge what Kotsky had and hadn't done? He'd worked hard for this dream, damn it. Another part of him, however, knew that Shinso had a point. Kotsky had never been bullied or told he couldn't be a hero. His quirk was perfect, and it had opened more doors than it had closed. He couldn't possibly understand what Shinso had gone through his whole life, and how it felt to work that hard only to fail at the moment when it truly mattered. But still, that didn't give Shinso the right to discount everything Katsuki had done to get to where he was. He was quiet for another long moment before he finally spoke, almost too quiet to be heard over the noise of the street as they left the gates behind. You don't go from being a bully to being a hero without a whole lot of work. Shinso stopped and stared at him for a long moment as he processed that, but he obviously didn't know how to respond to it because he ended up just shaking his head and falling into step beside Katsuki again. He couldn't blame him for not having thought of it like that. Just like Katsuki had never been bullied, Shinso had never been a bully. He didn't know just how much Katsuki had had to fight to leave all that behind and be more than just another jerk whose quirk let him get away with anything. He had never had to uproot everything he used to be to become who he wanted to be. There was a difference. Wanting to get away from that sore subject, Katsuki looked Shinso up and down. You've put on a little muscle since the last time I saw you. I'll give you that. But did you even think of learning how to fight? My quirk. Shinso started like that would explain everything, but Katsuki cut him off. Won't always be there for you, Katsuki said. Even my perfect quirk has limitations, dumbass. I sweat nitroglycerin. What am I supposed to do in the cold, huh? If you really want to be a hero, you gotta know how to fight. They were getting close to the train station, and Katsuki knew they'd be getting on different trains. He considered just leaving the kid now and never looking back. It wasn't like Shinso was Katsuki's responsibility or something. It was his own damn fault he'd failed the exam. He could have trained harder. But Katsuki silently groaned. He could practically hear Amplifier's voice in his head, smugly reminding him of that stupid final lesson. Find a way to pass it on. If Ogawa were here, he'd probably take the stupid kid under his wing the same way he'd taken on Katsuki, wouldn't he? Katsuki finally huffed, scribbled something on a receipt he'd dug out of his pocket, and shoved it into Shinso's hand. Meet me at this address at noon on Saturday. Don't you dare waste my time, got it? Shinso stared at the paper suspiciously. What? What are you gonna do? Isn't it obvious? Katsuki put his hands in his pocket and stalked off. I'm gonna teach you how to fight. By the time Denki started feeling like himself again, pretty much everyone had already left the infirmary. Recovery Girl was doing some paperwork at her desk, and Denki grimaced apologetically as he gathered his things that someone had obviously been nice enough to bring from the locker rooms. Thanks for taking care of me. It's no problem, dearie. Recovery Girl said kindly, it's my job to make sure students here are kept safe, especially when they get quirk exhaustion. I hope I wasn't too much trouble, Denki laughed. I can be a total idiot when I fry my brain like that, you know? I've had friends send me too many dumb recordings, so... You mostly just babbled nonsense. A gruff voice said behind him, but President Mike does that when he's at full capacity, so I don't think you have anything to worry about. Denki yelped and spun around. He hadn't known anyone else was still here. Sure enough, however, there was a guy that looked like an annoyed hobo, rubbing at his ears as he crawled out of his sleeping bag. Seriously? Did you have to scream? Denki looked between the hobo and Recovery Girl, who didn't seem fazed by his random appearance. I'm sorry? Don't tease the young man, Aizawa. Recovery Girl scolded. Don't pay him any mind, dearie. He just enjoys scaring new students. But I suppose everyone needs a hobby. Aizawa rolled his eyes and turned back to Denki. That's a nasty quirk drawback you've got. Yeah. Denki rubbed the back of his neck nervously. I've been training different ways of fighting so I don't run into my limit. So I haven't actually fried my brain like that in a while, but I'm all right, though. It's been happening since my quirk developed, so I'm totally used to it. It's like a natural high, right? Not that I do drugs or anything like that. Just, Like, from what I've seen on the internet, it's kind of similar. Denki smiled awkwardly as Aizawa gave an amused huff. Well, you're going to have to keep training. Once you're a pro hero, there won't always be people around to make sure you don't hurt yourself like there was today. You can't be a good hero if your plan is to make yourself a burden on your teammates. Now get going before your parents get worried. Yes, sir! Denki nodded frantically and bowed to Recovery Girl before running out of the infirmary. Thanks again! Thank me by not getting injured again. Recovery Girl yelled after him. Recovery Girl waited until the door swung closed behind Kaminari before turning back to Shota. It's not him, is it? Shota stared at the door the kid had just run out. No, it's not. Their personalities are too different, and Viridian wouldn't have been able to hide it if he recognized me. Not to mention the fact that I can't sneak up on Viridian anymore. Kaminari's situational awareness doesn't even come close. He'd have to keep an eye on Kaminari, though. After talking to him, Shota was fairly certain that he wasn't a vigilante. But that didn't mean he didn't have some sort of connection to Viridian. With such a distinct fighting style, they had to at least have come in contact. And while Kaminari mentioned he'd been training, he hadn't made any mention of what he'd been doing or who he'd been training with. Shota could have pushed, maybe even could have asked who trained him. But without knowing their connection, he had to assume that whatever he asked Kaminari would eventually get back to Viridian, and he couldn't risk the problem child panicking and disappearing again. Still, though, even if Kaminari wasn't Viridian, he might lead them to who the kid was, or even convince the real Viridian to turn himself in willingly. There's one other thing I think you should be aware of, Aizawa. Recovery Girl said seriously. I had multiple students across all exam sites complain that they were worried about getting stung by all the bees hanging around. Toshinori hid awkwardly in one of the side hallways as he waited for the student that Aizawa had pointed out to pass by on his way out. The two of them might have very different approaches to heroism, but despite Aizawa's obvious dislike of him, Toshinori couldn't help but respect the man's opinion. He had an amazing reputation as a teacher and a good eye for potential, something that Toshinori, in his current predicament, wished was true for himself. Nedzu had told him to be patient and to get to know the students before worrying too much about picking the right successor. But every scolding he got from Recovery Girl just reminded him that he was running out of time. If Aizawa was taking an interest in a particular child, however, then there was a good chance that the boy had what it took to become the next symbol of peace. Not that Toshinori was entirely relying on his coworker, of course. Young Kaminari's performance in the entrance exam had been more than enough to impress him on its own. He obviously had excellent control of a very powerful and dangerous quirk, which would hopefully make the transition to One for All much less painful than it could be. And he'd honed his body for combat, so the boy already had enough muscle that the quirk shouldn't blow his limbs off. Physically, the boy was exactly what he was looking for. That wasn't what had impressed him the most, however. No, what had impressed Toshinori the most had been the way that Kaminari had obviously known that destroying the zero-pointer would take him beyond his quirk's limit, but he'd done it anyway, just to save a fellow examinee. It was that dedication to save people, no matter what, that would make him a great hero and a perfect successor for One for All. When he saw the distinct yellow and black hair rushing toward him down the hall, Toshinori grew into his muscle form and stepped out in front of him, making the young man fall on his rear end in surprise and shock. All Might? Toshinori grinned. I am here. End of chapter.